Hey everyone, welcome to today's episode of Tapping into the Human. I am very excited to have one of my favorite guests. I think I'll have Jessie Dunleavy, who is the author of actually one of my favorite books, Cover My Dreams in Ink, which is just an incredible story about her son, about his journey in addiction and recovery, and to be honest, just much more about his learning disabilities, kind of how unjust the justice system is, and so many other things that we'll get into in today's episode. Thanks to David Poses for introducing Jessie and I. So Jessie, thank you so much for being here. I'm very happy to have you on today.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
For sure. So I know your story and there's so much to it. And we were just fortunate enough to have you on last week or the week before for our book club, which I thought was really fun and exciting, and had an opportunity to kind of do a full Q&A with you. But for those of us who are not familiar with you and what you do, you're sort of an activist now, and Paul's story. Can you just kind of give us a little bit of synopsis of who you are and Cover My Dreams in Ink?
Sure. I learned a lot about Paul's journey in hindsight. Obviously, I lived it with him, but when things happen over time, you don't always make the connections that you do when you're looking back. And also, when you're writing a book, which I was inspired to do, that happens tenfold because you're actually literally gathering pieces of information and collating them and making connections. So I learned that my son's disabilities put him at a disadvantage, obviously, and he was misunderstood in school. He wasn't just a standard LD child and needed a different strategy. He had attentional problems. He had a hand tremor, and he knew more than he could express. And by the time he was in his early 20s, he had started to self-medicate. And it's so predictable. And as a parent, I didn't really think about that being any more predictable with him than you would with a mainstream child. But I can now so clearly see, in fact, most people who fall into addiction, not drug use, because drug use and addiction are two different things. And so, but fall into it and don't just naturally outgrow it, they're the ones who are the most vulnerable. And they either had some kind of developmental disability or some kind of trauma or some kind of isolation. And so it's very sad, especially considering that they're the people that we think punishment is the best way to go. And, that it's just the opposite of what they need. So it's through writing the book and through recounting Paul's experiences that I connected all of the pieces that had turned me into an activist. And I did a lot of research with regard to addiction and recovery, and just a deeper look at what's on the surface, because what's on the surface is really mostly false.
Yeah, inaccurate.
And so the more you learn, the more inspired you get to want to share it with others, because it isn't just like, oh, come look at what I learned, but we're talking about life and death. And we're talking about more deaths each year that I've been doing this. It was so shocking to the country when there were 40,000 overdose deaths. And that's the time at which we said, oh, we have a crisis. And we put a lot of resources and a lot of airtime and a lot of discussion about the crisis. And now, the past 12 months, it's 100,000. And we called it a crisis when it was 40,000. So it's beyond a crisis. And it's a tragedy, too, because these people are dying before they get the chance to recover. Most people do recover. Addiction isn't a lifelong condition in most cases.
Yeah, no, it's and I love what you did, right? And I know we chatted about this on the book club, but you hear 100,000 lives lost in the past year and you say, "Oh, what a tragedy." Oh, how awful that is. And then you match stories like Paul's to every single person and you realize it's just not a number. These are 100,000 human beings with amazing capabilities, and they're special people, and they have lives, and they have family and friends. And I just think, a lot of people hear that statistic and sort of like, oh, 100,000, next year might be 110, but having stories like these to pull out the narrative, kind of like the Humans of Addiction stuff we do, to really say, hey, these are similar stories to you and me, and these are just regular people with who have lost their lives because of something that really could be prevented.
Right, and it's a loss to society. It's a loss, obviously, to a family and to that person who deserved to live
Yeah.
and didn't make it. But even if you look at the world through an economic lens, the amount of money we're losing in productivity of these people, our actual life expectancy has gone down because of this death toll. And 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, people who were addicted to heroin weren't dying at the rate they are now.
Yeah.
And so, I believe our policies are just massively flawed. And that's where the frustration comes in. But another thing, back to your point, I think you're right that when it's humanized for you,
Exactly.
you connect to it.
You feel
And
it.
I think a story like Paul's, one thing I was really hoping is at the outset, and it certainly wasn't to say, "Oh, look at what we went through." I had it rough. No, it was to have you understand this child, and I believe as you do, and you travel the journey with him,
Yeah.
so to speak, you're endeared by him. He's
a
got
thousand
a
percent
lot of endearing qualities, and he's kind-hearted, and he does struggle with his differences, but he's amazingly resilient, so he's got a lot of strength. And you then say, "Wait a minute, this isn't a moral failure."
Exactly. Well,
Whereas
that's
there
exactly, you want to root
you
for
wanna
him.
do
You
that
want
because
him
you
to
fall
succeed.
in love with him.
Yeah.
One of the people who wrote a, advanced praise for the book, a man named Roger Parloff, who was, the editor-in-chief of Fortune magazine at one point in time, and he's just a journalist of high caliber, to put it mildly. He said he had many people who loved him, especially his mother, but she made us love him too. And that is just one of those lines that stayed with me because that's exactly what I didn't even know I wanted it, but when I read that, I thought, "Yes, yes."
That's
I
the
couldn't
point.
put it in
Yeah.
those words, but
Well,
you
and
just
you do
love me.
fall in love with Paul, and I think I mean, obviously your writing's incredible, but you know, as I was reading the book, right, kind of you come out from the onset, and this was me, almost a year ago when my friend passed, and having all these, stigmas in my head saying it's a choice. Well, why don't they just work harder and they can get out of it? And I think, I've obviously learned a ton in the past year, and I no longer have that mindset. But I think for someone who picks up your book and is just expecting, well, hey, addiction is addiction and this is a choice, and have all these stigmas in their head. I think if they pick up your book and read it, it is a perfect example of how everything that we are taught, even from when we were young, right? All these misconceptions, you just flip it on its head. It's a 180-degree turn of, wow, okay, this is sort of checking exactly what I thought was wrong with the system. And well, actually, in reality, these people want to get better. They want to be happy. They want to be healthy. And especially for vulnerable people like Paul, the system is just stacked against them, right? Like, I do want to talk about, there was a time where he, broke his parole, and he was, using again, and he had to go to jail. Can you sort of talk about that? Because that, as a mother, I can only imagine for someone like Paul being stuck in jail for like literally not doing anything, but it was frightening as a reader, and you just wanted to go in there and hold him and protect him. Can you talk
It
about that?
it was a disaster. Um, it is such a horrible place. Um, and I can't speak to every prison system in the country,
Yeah.
but he was in a horrible place. For one thing, he was hungry. And and knowing that your child is hungry,
Mm.
it doesn't get much worse. A family could send their inmate um, money through a green dot money card. I never heard of this. You go to 7-Eleven and say, okay, I need a green dot money card. No checks, no cash, so I understand that. But, and that way you can use the commissary, and you really want to use the commissary because they don't give you toothpaste or shampoo
Yeah.
or anything like that. So he needed the commissary. Plus, he's hungry, so they have things, I imagine, like snacks. Or and
Snacks.
he said snacks. I don't know. I don't think it was apples, but whatever. Um, the minute he took it out of the envelope, when he opened it from me, it was taken from him because the other inmates, wherever he went, he was an easy mark.
Yeah.
And if you're even in school, children can be cruel. And he'd go to the candy store down at the corner when he was a kid, and I'd give him a $5 bill to get a candy bar, which at the time probably cost 50 cents. And he'd come back without any change. So they knew, that he
Yeah.
was an easy mark. And so in a system like that, here he had been mistreated, or people weren't sensitive to his differences wherever he went, but this is a whole different kettle of fish. And so he was sexually exploited. I don't go into that in the book, but it was just a horrible place. And he was in a cell that something like 10 feet by 10 feet with another person, and he was in there for 23 hours a day.
Yeah.
They ate in there. And it was years after he got out of that place that I read an article in, was it US News and World Report? I don't know, but it was one of the news magazines. And it said, this particular facility is one of the worst in the countries. The inmates run the place.
Yeah.
Um, each cell has a bunk. And this is the part that just killed me. A rimless
Toilet.
toilet
Yeah.
sink combination. I, I know I've been protected in some way. I was horrified. I was horrified by that. And how it's hot in the summer and cold in the winter, and the paint's peeling and bare light bulbs and nothing comfortable. I mean, it's just horrible. So it was a terrible experience. And prison systems make money. There aren't as many private prisons as most people think. But where they make money is on the commissary and on the phone system. And so you could pay to be able to talk to him. So he couldn't just call me, but
Yep.
if I
Call
paid,
you.
and it's an account that you open, it's called, at the time, it was called Talk to Your Inmate. So I paid, and you had to keep putting money in to make sure that he could get through. And I'm in Annapolis, Maryland. He's in Baltimore, Maryland, about 35 miles apart. We couldn't hear each other. The static and the interference on the line was so horrendous that we really couldn't make out each other's words. It wasn't just that it was difficult, we couldn't hear each other. And he's in tears, and he
Yeah.
needs to tell me something, and I'm paying for this, and it's not working. So there's a lot of profit made on these phone systems. And now I understand that they're not allowing mail anymore in some places, but
Really?
instead you have access to a tablet, so you can send an email. And of course, they oversee it, but they charge you for it.
Yeah.
So and when you think too that most people who are in the prisons are economically deprived, and then their poor families are having
You're
to
just not gonna
shell
be able to
out
get in
money
touch with them.
for shampoo and to talk with them, and now to even communicate with them via mail. So it's
It's
awful.
yeah, it's just it's
It's awful.
fundamental
He was
human
mistreated by
rights.
everybody. He was mistreated by the people that ran the place. He was mistreated by the other
Inmates.
inmates, and he shouldn't have been there. It wasn't the answer.
Yeah, no, I know. It's so heartbreaking, and you realize, after, if you just do a little bit of education, there is no proof, no evidence, no data, nothing to suggest that those who are dealing with substance abuse issues or addiction or anything like that benefit from a punitive justice system like that. In fact, when people then leave those systems, they are so much more likely to die from an overdose because they no longer have any tolerance, and there's no bridge to connect the prison system in real life.
Right, right. And also they're coming out further wounded
Yeah,
in terms of the isolation. So you're dealing with a vulnerable person. Most people who use addictive drugs don't become addicted.
right.
And
90%
I grew
don't.
up thinking, oh, you touch heroin once and that's it. That's it.
Yeah.
It's a dramatic turning point in your life, and you're hooked forever. And so it always worried me. But looking back on my own youth, my 20s, and the people that I knew, sure, there are a lot of people who used what we called hard drugs at the time. It wasn't just pot, it was cocaine or whatever, methamphetamine, but they outgrew it. They didn't really become addicted. So, when boys were coming back from Vietnam, the country was worried that we were going to have hundreds of thousands of heroin addicts because there was a lot of heroin use over there. But these people came home, and the high percentage of them, 75 or 80%, never used again because they had a life worth living.
Yeah.
And so that's the turning point. But for the people who do outgrow it, it's just like you might go in the bars more when you're in your 20s or late teens, and you're kind of stumbling around, and you might have a job, but you might not, and you might be sleeping on somebody's couch, and then you get a job that you like and you're interested in it. You've got a chance for a promotion, or you fall in love, or there's a child in your life all of a sudden. And so these things that are just part of the natural maturation process pull you away from that drug use. But the people who can't get out of it without help, they're the vulnerable ones. They're the ones that don't have anything pulling them up. And then we take them and punish them.
Yeah.
So it is absolutely the opposite. And there is no truth to the concept that in order to be ready for recovery, you have to hit rock bottom. It
Concur.
just simply isn't true. And so it's just one of those fallacies. And so parents will actually turn their back on a child because and they may be loving and empathetic people, but they're thinking, no, he's got to hit rock bottom.
And tough love,
No,
tough
if
love.
hitting rock bottom was the answer, everybody would be coming out of prison all ready to go.
Well
Let,
said.
let, let's get on with it. We're better now. No, there's just so much that needs to be done, and it is so very sad. And economic insecurity is a big contributor
Yes,
to drug use and that hopelessness. You can understand it.
for sure.
But then you get out and you're economically disadvantaged, and you can't get in public housing because you have a record,
Yeah. Get
and
a
you
job.
can't apply for a scholarship in a college program because you have a record. So we take the vulnerable people, we do something that doesn't help them, and then we turn them out with more strikes against them than they had going in.
Yeah.
And so we really just have to stop the punitive. If you're violent and you violate the rights of others, then there has to be some system for keeping you um, out of the danger zone, bringing harm to others. So I understand that. But when it's a nonviolent crime, possession of marijuana or whatever drug, jail isn't the right place, and we're overloading our jail system. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world. It's embarrassing. And so I would think that we'd be delighted to lop off the people who aren't guilty of
You would
violating
think.
the rights of others. But no, we're not. We are hell bent
Yeah. Yeah,
on
no,
public
it's a whole
criminal justice.
perspective
It is
shift.
the war on drugs. And you know what? All of us, myself included, none of us were alive when drugs were last legal. They've been illegal our whole life. So we are in this mindset that, well, that's illegal. And so you don't, like you said at the outset, you don't really think deeply about it. And so that's where the stigma comes from. And maybe
100%.
I know that destigmatizing is a goal, but I don't know how in the world you
I know.
destigmatize something that we criminalize you for.
Well, exactly. And, I think about it this way too, right? Like, and I know you and I have chatted about this sort of extensively, but our laws, right, reflect the sign of the time. So unless we start electing people and demanding from our representatives, well, this whole thing is BS. The war on drugs doesn't work. It's actually killing people. You need to increase access to medication assisted treatment. You need to increase the number of supervised injection sites, whatever it may be. It's going to continue to be the same narrative that it is, right? You have a very small minority, for example, in Congress who are even thinking about that stuff because it's controversial. So unless we start rising up and saying we demand this, this doesn't make any sense and going about it with the data. But I hate to say it, you even go at some people with the data, and they will refute the data with some, BS claim
There,
of
there is
whatever.
there is a huge gap between the science and the research
Yep.
and our policies. There is a huge gap. And some of our lawmakers really do get it, and they fight for the reform that's needed. Some get it, but don't want to fight, don't want to stand up
Yep.
because it could cost them their position. And it's a conundrum because when we say, well, he did that just to get reelected, that sounds so smarmy. But in one way, I can understand it
Right.
because if I think I'm the best person for the job and I'm going to help with poverty and I'm going to help with the humanistic goals that would make for a better society, but yet I'll lose to a person who won't bring any humanism to it. If I stand up for decriminalizing drugs, then maybe I can't take that stand because in the end it costs more to
Mm.
society. So it's tough. So really, sometimes I think instead of trying to educate our elected officials, we've got to educate society. But the media doesn't help us.
Yeah.
That's a sweeping statement, but you would think because there is so much science and so much data and so much factual information that that would be what's perpetuated. And it isn't. It's so frustrating to read articles and you just think, why are you embellishing these misunderstandings? I guess some of it's sensationalism. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's tough, and I've talked about this extensively, but I think the most difficult thing, and is especially when you're trying to learn about addiction, and no one has the attention span unless you're really invested in it. You really could care less. So it's whatever you see. So the media certainly doesn't help. But all that needs to be done, right, is if you actually take 5 minutes to question sort of your understanding of everything and you look up the information, sometimes you'll be able to find it. The challenging part I find with addiction is that there are so many different answers even within the same community. You have some doctors who you feel like would be educated on it, but they're simply not, and they don't want to prescribe, and they don't take the waivers that you need to prescribe buprenorphine, for example.
Right, but
And
we
you have
shouldn't even have a waiver.
Right. And then you have the 12-step program that says you have to do this, and if you don't, you're going to die. And then you have other people who say, harm reduction is necessary in order to survive. You have so many different things. So, for example, when I was trying to learn, well, what's the right answer when it comes to addiction? We have a fragmented community versus for cancer. You go to a particular specialist that deals with that exact type of cancer, and it's not controversial what you do. You treat it with medicine.
Right. So we need just an overarching goal
Yeah.
to see addiction as a public health dilemma, as a medical condition,
Right.
not a criminal justice condition. And so we have only exacerbated the problem with our policies. But it is frustrating that so many stakeholders will tell you different things.
Yeah.
But again, the science isn't confused.
Right.
The fact of the matter is the use of buprenorphine or methadone saves 50% at least of the lives. And that is just, it's irrefutable.
I agree.
It's been irrefutable for years. And you see study after study after study after study. And so that doesn't mean that everybody who recovers has to go that way. But it means that you can't deny people that opportunity and you can't
Exactly.
take somebody into treatment and not tell them about it. People can make decisions for themselves. And the stigma that surrounds the treatment is just as bad as the stigma that surrounds the
A
condition.
1000%. I honestly think, and this is the interesting thing, when you are dealing with addiction, the stigma is from the outside community. It's people who don't understand it. So you have to deal with that, and people are ashamed. Then, when you're in the community, the stigma comes from the community who understands addiction about medicine. That's what's so crazy. It's like you can't win, right? Because whether it's a 12-step program, or a certain doctor says, oh, you really shouldn't be on it, or you should only be on it for 6 months, it's not a long-term treatment. It's like I can only imagine being those people, right? I mean, I know Paul at one time went to 12-step programs. If he continued
That
going,
was state of the art. That was
yeah,
all there was. And
yeah,
I was naive. I didn't know, and it wasn't good for him. And I'm not saying therefore it's bad for everybody.
right. No, it works for a lot of
People
people.
too are so emotional about this. And if you recovered 20 years ago, let's just say, and you recovered and you were in a 12-step program, you fight for that 12-step program for everybody. And that doesn't make any sense. The analogy that I use is it's like saying, I met my husband on Match.com and we're very happy. Therefore,
Yeah,
if you didn't meet your husband on Match.com, then you're not going to be happy. No, no one thinks like that.
yeah,
So a lot of the people who recovered through the 12-step program would have recovered anyway because there's so many people who just grow up and do it. And there's nothing like camaraderie and people who understand. And I do
supporting
get
you.
that.
Yeah.
But I can get it free in the church basement around the corner. There are 12-step programs in every community. And so why is insurance paying for inpatient when 12-step program is the mode of treatment, when it doesn't cost anything and no one denies that there's a role for peer support and camaraderie. If I have cancer, I'm going to go and get the medical treatment, and maybe I will be well served by a group of peers who have the same condition or did, or their family did. So there is a place for that connection with others who struggle as you do. But back to the medication, I do think more people are realizing that it
Works.
needs to
Yeah.
be more prevalent and that we shouldn't have all the restrictions that we have. And some of the restrictions were lifted a little bit
Yes.
during COVID. But the other piece of that is long-term use is associated with higher success than short-term use.
But they don't
Yet,
like that narrative.
but people will say, I had a physician yell at me when I was seeking buprenorphine for Paul. And he said, don't you know that you're just replacing one problem with
For
another?
another. Yeah.
Don't you know that he could be on this for the rest of his life? And I was intimidated by this man, and I regret that. Small in the world of my regrets, but I wished, well, maybe not so small. I wished I'd said to him, what it prolongs is life.
Isn't that what we want? Yeah.
And the other thing is, would I rather have Paul and have him be on buprenorphine or not have him? And also, no one says you have to stop taking your Prozac.
Yep. I'm on
So why
anxiety
is it that
medication.
some medications
Yeah.
are okay to take for life and other medications aren't?
I
Look
know.
at David Poses. The best thing about his book, other than it made me laugh
Yeah.
and cry, and was interesting, but the best message that it sent is that buprenorphine saved his life. He was on heroin for 20 years, and he had a hell of a struggle with it. And when he found the answer for him, he's been fine since, and he's fine. You're
And
not
he's still
high.
on it. And there's
Yeah,
no adverse reactions or
be on
anything.
it.
No, I
You'll be
agree
on
with
it
you,
for
Jesse.
life. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not reading the tarot cards, but that's what he's led me to believe. And so, and he's not alone. It's really just terrible that we have this prejudice. And then the poor person on methadone,
Yeah, I know.
that's a whole other nightmare that you have to go and line up and be mistreated.
Every day.
And you can't. I have a friend whose son is on methadone. They go on vacation, he can't go because he's got to go every day. They're not going to give you 2 weeks worth. No,
Yeah.
no. And they treat you like, yeah, I'm not, again, I don't like to make sweeping statements. I know there are a lot of good hearted people who work in these facilities, but for the most part, those people are treated like criminals.
I know.
They're suspect. I saw something the other day where somebody was arrested waiting in line for her methadone. And she was arrested because she had, I don't know, a wrapper from some dust from some drug, something that maybe had been in her pocket a long time. I don't know. But I think If you really want to go and look for people to arrest, go look at the lines there, go into the projects, go into the vulnerable um, communities, and you can make a lot of arrests. But this poor woman was put in jail, and then she didn't have her methadone anymore. What are we doing? It's just inhumane,
It's maddening. It's
and
maddening.
it's there's a lot of corruption too within the treatment systems, and I'm not pointing the finger at all of them by any means, but you know about the places that'll say you're ready to go, and then they're in cahoots with the people who offer you drugs, and then you're back in because it's a money making industry. And again, I don't think that most people who are working with people who are suffering, have that sinister approach, but still, there's a lot of corruption because it's unregulated. Again, back to the cancer, or let's use diabetes for a change. Um, there's a medical system that's highly accountable to accreditation and to certification and to staying abreast of the science and what's available in terms of treatment. But this is all, a lot of times you go into a facility where not only is there not a medical professional, there might not be a college graduate. Not that that separates the men from the boys, but still, these are good-hearted people who've been through it themselves and they want to help.
Right.
But if you have a co-concurrent occurring condition, or if you do need medication, these people aren't going to know it, and they're just driving that 12-step program because again, it was good for them. So it's unfortunate, and it's tied up with insurance and
Yeah,
lobbyists, and it's a conundrum
it is.
because you know th- there's a lot of money to be made with the war on drugs, and so you're fighting
You're
maybe
fighting a lot of different parties. That's the challenge here, right? It's like, I mean, we just talked about like insurance companies, pharmaceuticals, the government, DEA. Like there's so much. And I think, and I know you and I both believe it, like a huge part of this is the stigma and education. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I know that's why you're doing what you're doing. If we can just get people educated, at least so they just get the basic facts when the government or whoever is saying, oh, well, no, 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 this is the answer. You're like, actually, no. Like, you don't know what you're talking about and you can stand up, right? Like, you were talking about that doctor who's like, oh, no, Paul shouldn't be on buprenorphine. It's education is power, right? You could now go back and say to this guy, actually, the statistics say 79% and go on, right?
Mhm.
But if you don't know, and this is what I always say, like, in order to help a loved one, people are always like, Alex, like, how can I help my loved one suffering? Educate yourself and give them the options. Everyone thinks they got to go to a 12-step meeting and go away for 30 days into recovery. Hey, that might work for some people, but you actually don't need that, right?
But they don't have a good track record, and inpatient isn't all it's cracked up to be. If you have a if you're homeless or unhoused, um, then maybe you need that roof over your head. But if you have a place to live, you're much better off as an outpatient than an inpatient, just in terms of the data. And you can be an outpatient who's on medication and forego even the therapy.
Yeah, I know.
Now, I know that there's controversy with regard to that, but that's why a lot of people, certainly those on the leading edge of the research, don't even want to call it MAT anymore
Yeah. Because
because
why is it medication assisted treatment? It's just treatment.
yeah, and it's medication for opioid use disorder. So they're calling it MOU.
UD.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, that's a mouthful, but nevertheless, it can be misleading, and you don't say medication assisted when again
Just,
you're on insulin.
yeah, it's
You
just
know,
treatment.
and so many of our health conditions, not all by any means, but they are exacerbated by lifestyle choices. The cigarette smoker who has lung cancer, well, you could say, well, he brought that on himself, so we'll put him in jail instead of
Right.
treating his lung
Yeah,
cancer.
can you
Well,
imagine?
no, can you imagine?
No.
And so we treat the lung cancer and he continues to smoke. We don't say we're not treating you anymore.
Exactly. Or we don't shame him, right?
And the diabetic who's on insulin, we don't take it away because you ate a box of cookies. So
Yeah.
we really have to stop the criminalization. And it was racist and mean-spirited in the first place. And you'd think we would have learned with alcohol prohibition,
Yep.
because alcohol prohibition brought on more problems than it solved. And it doesn't mean that there aren't some people who unfortunately, have ruined their lives because of alcohol. But so they make it illegal. So the people who used to drink beer and wine can't get it anymore. So they're drinking bathtub gin or moonshine or whatever they could get. It's much more dangerous. It's much more addictive. And it gave rise to violent crime, the underground market. And so we've done the same thing with drugs. They are so much more potent. In Canada, they don't just have buprenorphine or methadone, they have heroin assisted treatment,
Yep.
because pure heroin isn't going to kill you.
Right.
And a low dose of heroin can be a gradual way to get over your addiction and not risk the additives that we're risking now.
Yeah. Safe
And
supply. Safe supply.
so, yeah, safe supply. So, I mean, that's a big leap for people in
It
this
is.
country. But, that's kind of a shame too, because other countries have gotten their minds around that. I was in a meeting the other day, and we were listening to a man who lives in Canada, who was talking about dispensing machines,
Yep.
dispensing clean syringes or
Yep.
condoms or
There's
even
quite a few in
morphine.
Canada.
And so it's a wonderful idea because they're open 24 hours a day, and people can access what they need to stay safe. And so I did ask him, because clean needles are certainly one of the most used
Right.
supplies that people need, and that have a wonderful track record of saving lives and lowering the spread of disease. It's incredibly successful. But I said to him, is paraphernalia illegal in Canada? He said, no, we don't want to be bothered with that. We want to get people better. And it just makes you so envious. Oh, we want to be bothered with it. We're hotly
Right.
bothered with it. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, we're going to go after you for paraphernalia when you have no drug. So we're just assuming that you're going to break a law. So we're going to arrest you, and you can be put in jail for
Yeah.
years
Yeah.
for possessing a pipe.
Yeah. We're just gonna arrest you. It's like we're just gonna arrest you for driving because
Oh,
we think
we love
you're gonna
that.
speed.
Yeah,
It's yeah. No,
yeah.
I know.
And
It's crazy.
so, it really, really is. And there is no data anywhere that suggests that the time in jail served any purpose for the person who's struggling with addiction.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, not all drug users are addicted. There are people who use drugs recreationally and who do so successfully, not unlike alcohol. Alcohol is more dangerous than a
It
lot
is.
of the drugs that
Yep.
we classify as, you know,
Hard drugs.
highly, highly criminal
Yeah.
to use. And we have people who use drugs. Look, don't think there aren't people working on Wall Street that are using cocaine, and it might be a weekend thing, it might be a once a month thing. But if they're arrested, which is highly unlikely because we're much more likely to go into the marginalized communities than we are to mess with people in the wealthy communities. Nor are we going onto Columbia University's campus and busting people for pot.
Yeah.
We just don't.
Yeah.
So we go after the people who are vulnerable. But the people, if you are arrested, though, let's just say you use drugs recreationally and you've never had an addiction problem, but you're arrested for possession. Well, they want to put you in treatment. You don't need treatment. And they think drug court is the benevolent way to go. Well, it's not if you don't need treatment.
Right. That's why I love Portugal and what they're doing, because if you are using, it's decriminalized, but if you are using drugs or, and it gets to a certain point, you go to a court type system, but it's with medical professionals, psychologists, doctors who deal with addiction, specialize in it. And the vast majority, they can give a fine, but the vast majority end up just going free because they're like, oh, you don't know, you've gone through our test, you're not addicted, and then they go on about their lives. There's no criminal record. It's so tough, because the more I find, and I'm sure you'd agree with this, Jesse, like I find the more that I know, the more angry I am, because
Mm.
you just realize, like, if people like you and me who were in power, who could really start changing these things, just had sort of the same thoughts that you and I, we'd be so much better off. There would just be lives saved, and isn't that the whole point of
There
what we
would be
want?
money saved. Do you
Yeah.
know that we not only have the highest prison population in the world by far, we have 5% of the world's population and 25% of its prisoners. So it's utterly shameful.
Yeah.
And we spend, the last time I did a little poking around with this, we spent 80 billion a year on incarcerating people and 12 billion a year on education.
Yeah. Shouldn't it be the opposite here?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So here we have more prisoners than any, mass incarceration is just an embarrassment, but it's costing us money and we're not prioritizing where we should be putting the money.
Yeah.
It's and harm reduction. Let's talk about harm reduction. That's all controversial. Why? Why? There's no one I've talked to yet that you sit down and explain it to them
And then they're
that
like,
walks
"Oh, we
away
should do
saying,
that."
"Oh, harm reduction is seat belts. Harm reduction
Bike
is
helmets.
sunscreen.
Yeah.
Harm reduction is fences around pools and helmets.
Yeah.
Some of the harm reduction is regulated by the law. You have to wear your seatbelt. Some of it is just good old common sense. Nobody's going to arrest you if you don't use sunscreen. But harm reduction acknowledges that human behavior can, humans do take risks, and let's minimize the risks.
Yeah.
So driving a car is a risk. People die in car accidents. So, we want to minimize those risks. So it's crazy to say, well, harm reduction enables drug use. Do you know how many people say that? And it's sometimes as an elected official, and you just think you should know better.
Yeah.
You should just know better.
And they should.
Okay, so let's just say they open a syringe service program around the corner from me. I'm unlikely to say, oh, I've never used drugs before, but
Now
now that
I
they
am.
have this
Yeah.
the syringe program, I think I'm going to start.
Yeah.
No, nor is the person who's addicted going to say, well, I was going to hold off, but now that they've got the clean syringes, I'm going to go for it. No, that person's going to use a dirty
Exactly.
needle and spread disease to those of us who don't even use drugs. But we don't want to give them clean syringes. I mean,
Yeah.
everybody knows since the 80s that syringe programs save lives. But yet you have people who don't want them.
Yeah. No,
They
it's
they
tough.
enable drug use. How, explain to me, show me some data that substantiates that clean syringes increase and encourage drug use.
I agree. No, it's so tough, Jesse. And I was gonna say, obviously, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. You and I can go on forever and ever
Oh yeah,
because
we could.
we're both so aligned on all this stuff, and I think it's really important. Um, my last question to you, and I always ask this, to our audience, what is your piece of advice? What do you want people to know? And then we'll talk about where they can find your book and follow you on Instagram and all that cool stuff.
I guess one primary message is that good people can fall into bad circumstances, and they are often victims of their circumstances, and it's not representative of a character flaw or a moral failure. So compassion for people who are struggling is so important. And the other is that our policies have increased the death toll. And until we take a new tack, we're going to continue to see this climb. And we have all these strategies and we spend money, but we're not measuring the what we've implemented against the death toll because it's so obvious that it's not working. The war on drugs is a colossal failure. There's
I
no
agree.
good that's come from it.
Yeah.
So that's the two
No, I
messages.
appreciate it, Jesse. And where can we find Cover My Dreams in Ink? Is that available on Amazon?
Yes, and if you go to my website, which is jessedunleavy.com,
Cool.
there are buttons for Barnes and Noble and Amazon and all of the
Awesome.
retailers. Here locally, it's in the public library and in a few bookstores,
Awesome.
but online's the easiest way. And so, yeah, that's the way to get
Okay.
it.
Well, Jesse, thank you so much for all your
Thank
time.
you, Alex. Thank you
Really
for
appreciate
everything
it.
you do. I admire you and
Thank you.
appreciate you and think that what you're doing is awesome.
I appreciate that. Awesome. Okay, everyone. Well, thank you so much for joining today's episode and make sure you pick up a copy of Cover My Dreams in Ink. Thanks so much.
Take care.